Hi explorers, welcome back. I'm Joe, and today we're doing a Maryland Time book review. The book we're looking at today is James Michener's Chesapeake. Chesapeake, like many of Michener's other works, is a years-long epic. In this case, we're taking on 14 voyages that span everything from indigenous peoples of the Eastern Shore in the late 1500s to the 1970s when the book in real life was written. The novel is centered almost exclusively on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, particularly around the Choptank River area in both Talbot and Dorchester counties, although we do briefly go to Germany and a few other places like the West Indies around the Revolution and things like that. Each voyage focuses on a theme or central issue that would have affected the people of the time. For example, when we get to Voyage 8, that's set in the 1830s, slavery is the core theme of that part of the book. We do see a bunch of different perspectives on it, which I think adds a lot of depth. Without spoiling too much, Chesapeake is a work of fiction that allows a fictitious group of people navigating through real events that takes place in like a narrative format. So think kind of like Killer Angels or Shogun. I think it makes it so I read a lot of dry historical text for the channel, obviously, and just kind of as my hobby, but I think it allows people that don't necessarily want to read dry history the opportunity to like get into stuff like this and kind of experience history, you might say, which sounds kind of goofy, but yeah. One of the charms that I really like about Chesapeake in particular, fully admitting that I'm kind of biased, but one of the charms I liked is that the focus on a voyage is like typically a family, or at least like a family at this time and then their offspring, as you can kind of see. Like, I think it adds another like layer of depth in the story. So it's not only what happened, how the characters react to it, but it's also like, this is what my dad thought of this, but this is my interpretation and how I live up to his legacy, or things like that. And I think that adds kind of like another layer of realism to the story, which I really appreciated. It also allows us to kind of organically move through time without like needing like subtext that says like 7 years later, 8 years later, which for me I find pretty distracting as I'm like reading something, if we're just like cutting through time all willy-nilly. I think it also allows for like the plot and different subplots to be just driven by life and times of these characters. Like, all too often in a shorter story, subplots can kind of feel forced to me. And so with Chesapeake having the families, it really allows that to come out in a much better way, I think. I also really enjoyed having, now this is definitely my bias, but I enjoyed being able to read about places I'd actually like been and grew up through. Like the Turlock Marsh is very close to near where I grew up, near Cambridge. So that's just kind of cool. I think, kind of getting back to the comparison with Killer Angels, I think another thing that I really like about Chesapeake is having that voice show, not kind of tell. And I realize in a book that sounds kind of goofy. What I mean by that is, instead of somebody telling me like the Cambridge race riots happened in the 1960s as a result of X, Y, and Z, here's kind of what happened. We get to experience that through a character's eyes. So you can experience tensions that lead up to it, experience the flashpoint, and then you're much more emotionally connected to these stories that otherwise you wouldn't be, particularly in that one. So I think that kind of allowing that story to develop cradle to grave through someone's experiences really makes it a lot more powerful than just sort of like a Wikipedia article, for example, where it's like, yep, here's what happened, great, thanks, and then you move on. So to this point, I've kind of gotten into what I like about it and what I don't like about it, but let's take a step back and kind of more talk about what it is. So it is the story of the Eastern Shore in Maryland, but so like I said, we start with indigenous peoples, Pentaquad, who moves from the Susquehanna River area near Havre de Grace. Shout out to the first video about John O'Neill, if you haven't seen that. And then moves, as Pentaquad moves down into what will become Devon Island and in that area, and Dorchester and Talbot counties and stuff like that. We move through the colonial period, the Revolution, War of 1812, post-war period with quite a few things about slavery, and then through the Civil War, of course. After the Civil War, we get sort of towards the perspective of the emergence of canneries and watermen, and how the 20th century affected the Eastern Shore in particular. And if you're from the Eastern Shore, really from any rural area, I would imagine, the joke is always that the Eastern Shore is 20 years behind the other side of the bridge, the western side of Maryland. And so you can kind of, what was funny to me is you could kind of see that happening in real time where, like Baltimore, Annapolis, places like that in the book would continue to advance and the shore would stay the same, still using like sail-powered skipjacks, still using horses when there were cars and things like that. And so that was fun to see. So going on through the plot, we worked through World War II, we worked through the post-war era, and that's again since slavery ended, where we see a lot of race relations being critical. Also, an interesting part, particularly to me, is that you can see where after the war, real estate agents start buying up tons of land, and it gets more developed to be sort of a vacation spot for folks from like Washington, Annapolis, the other side of Maryland, which in my lifetime, was certainly still happening. So it's kind of very interesting to see that first part. And then finally, we get into environmental concerns with Maryland, the Eastern Shore, the Bay, all the waterways, estuaries, and how that impacted characters who had lived there in earlier time periods. So I have to say, for me, the first probably 9-10 voyages, so that's taking us from the 1500s through 1960-ish, maybe a little after the 1960s. Well, really, and I have to countermand myself here, because really the 1500s up until the 1940s, like, I thought were super strong, super powerful. You have all your big events, like I said, like the Revolution, like slavery, like the Civil War, and how watermen, waterfowl, things like that really developed on the shore. And you kind of see almost like an old cowboy tale where the cowboy is born, lives his life, and he dies at the end of the industrial age. You can kind of see the Eastern Shore go through that change, and I really like that. As we get to the more modern voyages, I feel like it weakened a little bit. I just, and it's not to say anything like the environment's not important or anything, I just don't think that those things necessarily kept the same gravity. Like, it didn't really feel as powerful as a lot of the other stuff does. And certainly some of that's my own bias as a reader, because there are some parts of earlier voyages that dragged. I just personally felt like it was a lot more engaging when it was a discussion about, like, even, for example, even in the earlier voyages, before we get to the Revolution, there's a discussion about like religious freedom and how that'll look in the new colony, and particularly in the communities that are on the Eastern Shore. And that, to me, just holds a lot more gravitas than a later voyage where it's a very real issue, and it's certainly important, but like picking up cans on the side of the road just kind of felt like it fizzled out a little bit, maybe. But all in all, Chesapeake is it's a really good read if you kind of want a primer on Maryland's development, because it does spend a lot of time talking about Baltimore and Annapolis and as the characters interact with that side of the bridge, but in particular Maryland's Eastern Shore, and how and why the Eastern Shore feels almost like, again, very biased here, but almost like a different state, certainly a different community than what you'll experience in the western side of the state. Out of the whole book, my favorite voyage has got to be Voyage 6, which covers the period between 1773 and 1811. So I really like this because this is the period, of course, where the Revolution happens and we see Maryland go from a colony to being a part of the fledgling U.S. But also, how does the Eastern Shore, how does Maryland, how does the United States rebuild when, obviously not exactly half, but a significant number of the population were Tories, were British sympathizers. So it deals with kind of like how do you deal with these deep fundamental differences with your neighbor, which I think in Maryland's case certainly would come up again in the Civil War. I have plans to take a look when we get to Gettysburg and talk about the 1st Maryland U.S. Army and the 1st Maryland Confederate States Army fighting each other. So other states certainly had that happen too. The Civil War was called the War Between the Brothers for a reason. But in Maryland, I found that it's very interesting to be able to point out a specific regiment or brigade that was split that evenly and fought against each other. So all in all, Chesapeake, I'd say, is a great read. It's a long slog. Don't let me mislead you. It's some heavy reading. I think all in it's like 12 or 1300 pages, somewhere around there. If you listen to the audiobook, it's like 54 hours. But either way, so it's very good at entertaining and conveying a lot of the history that Maryland has to offer, sort of as a primer. You'll definitely have to dig deeper if there's something there that pulls your interest, like the Quaker stuff or anything like that. But it also throws some cautionary tales and some life experience in there and kind of just shows you what growing up on the Eastern Shore might have been like through different periods in time. So if you have the means or you're looking for a new book, super recommend checking out Chesapeake by James Michener. Alright guys, take care. See you on the next one.